Excellent.
We're good. We're ready. You good? You ready?
Yep.
Okay. Not too. Okay, Boker Tov, Shavua Tov l'kulam. So good to be here for our second session and arguably our first proper class on the Tanaim and Amoraim, because last week was much more of an introductory class. You don't need the tables that I gave, but those who wish, I have a few spares. So these maps and tables, I have a few spares. No, because I said I'd bring them from last time. So I'll put them over here. I'll put them over here because they're not crucial for now, but those who want, they're right there. And just to remind you that today we're going to be looking at the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. Next week we're going to be talking about Shimon HaTzadik, Antigonus Ishocho, and then looking through some of those names and personalities who are listed in the first chapter of Pirkei Avot, because that is considered to be one of the best records of the early scholars of the old tradition, who predate the Tanaim and Amoraim, and then we're going to talk about the Zugot, of which they are part, and then get to the great teachers of the Mishnah and the Talmud, the Tanaim and the Amoraim. But our focus today is the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. And even the preparation I'd done for this class was slightly overshadowed by further reading that I've done, because this is a topic which is so misunderstood, and even books that I've turned to and we turn to for guidance and information sometimes only give you a partial picture of information, which is essential to make sense of this period and of this, shall we say, institution. So we have before us the first Mishnah Pirkei Avot, because this, as I say, is considered to be the primary source of telling us about those early years, okay? And the first Mishnah Pirkei Avot teaches us Moshe kibel Torah miSinai, ומסרה ליהושע ויהושע לזקנים, לזקנים לנביאים, ונביאים מסרו על אנשי כנסת הגדולה. Moses received the Torah at Sinai. I believe that we know that. He transmitted it to Yeshua, that's familiar. Yeshua lezkenim, Yeshua to the elders. We don't quite know who the elders are. They're not named, but we can guess that the elders are the people who came after Yeshua. Or uzkenim leneviim, the elders to the prophets. Okay, why the elders for the prophets? That itself we could debate, but that's not our responsibility. Uneviim masroa l'anshei knesset hagdolah. And the prophets transmitted the oral tradition to what is known as the men of the Great Assembly. That's how the phrase is almost universally translated. Hem amru shlosha dvarim. And this is a teaching of the men of the Great Assembly. Have mutunim badin, be patient. It says in administration of justice. That certainly the truth is the translation is limiting. Right, reflective. I can't remember where I got this translation from. Raise many disciples, make a fence around the Torah. We could discuss what those three things are. We are going to. Ignore that translation for the moment. My interest, though, is less immediately what they taught, but who is the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah? Because we often hear about this institution, but I'm not aware of a book that kind of is on the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. Even in a great library like this, or other places, you just see references here, there, and in the Talmud, references here, there, but often very brief, very terse references to who are the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. So that's really our responsibility for today, to make sense of what is the men of the Great Assembly. Now, there is one named member of the men of the Great Assembly in Pirkei Avot. He's named in Perk Aleph Mishnah Bet, the Mishnah that follows. We're going to get to him next time. Shimon HaTzadik. Shimon HaTzadik was Meshayirei Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, which seems to be amongst the remnants of the men of the Great Assembly, although some people have said actually it's a typo, I should say Mireshei, amongst the leaders of the men of the Great Assembly, but we're going to discuss him more next time. Still in Pirkei Avot, only one person is listed as a member of this institution. And in fact, that leads Rabbi Dr. Benny Lau in his book, The Sages, to say this is an anonymous group. We only know the name of one. Well, the answer is, on the basis of Pirkei Avot, he's correct. But actually, on the basis of the wider rabbinic tradition, he's incorrect. His book, importantly, was based on a series of Shurim and Pirkei Avot. So I hear why he said that, but it's not entirely true. We have, in fact, records which tell us for other members of the Anshe Knesset Agdolah, which go back far, far further than Shimon HaTzadik. So I want to begin actually by quoting from Aryeh Kaplan's Handbook of Jewish Thought. I don't know if you have those 2 volumes written by Aryeh Kaplan. They are fantastic. They are basically a jam-packed encyclopedia of thoughtful and highly referenced Jewish knowledge about things you'd think we should know, but so many of us don't. If you've read it, read it again. It's a book which I go back to quite often because Aryeh Kaplan had this wonderful ability to write simply and yet know all the material and give huge breadth of references and insights about things that most of us perhaps would be unaware. So I want to turn to his book precisely because he makes reference to the Anshe Knesset Agdolah with greater detail than many people, at least in English language. And he makes a few, for him is a throwaway comment, for me is an enlightening comment. So here's one of a number of the comments that we have here. If you have it at home, it's the yellow volume, the first one, right? Okay. So he says, oral Torah was handed down by word of mouth from Moses to Joshua, then to the elders, the prophets, and the Great Assembly. This is a summary of the Mishnah we just studied, okay? Then he explains who is the Great Assembly. The Great Assembly, meaning we have to talk about the men of the Great Assembly. Anshe Knesset Agdolah. He said, okay, Anshe means the members. Let's talk about the Knesset Agdolah. That's the institution. Anshe is just the members of. The Knesset Agdolah, the Great Assembly, was a Sanhedrin led by Ezra at the beginning of the time of the Second Temple, which undertook to enact legislation that would make Judaism viable in the diaspora. Now, let's just pause here. There's so much to explore. So let's give a sense of both timeline and kind of location line. So, as we know, the first temple was destroyed. Jews were exiled to Babylon. Many stayed there. Some came back in waves. Okay, Ezra was not the first wave. How do we know? Because we're told about it in the book of Ezra. Right. Ezra returns to Jerusalem after the second temple is being rebuilt by the first waves who came, and then the whole story with Koresh, who both granted permission for them to come back, and then the halting of the story, etc., and then the Purim story taking place around that time. Tachlis is, Ezra is the greatest Jewish scholar who was in exile and who comes back and who leads a remarkable movement, what we arguably call the Baal Tshuva movement, because many Jews had assimilated culturally whilst they were in Babylon. We know that from the names described in Sefer Ezra. So Ezra is the great elder scholar of the Jewish nation, but who knows what it means to live in the diaspora, who is excited to come back as part of the new chapter of Jewish history with the rebuilding of the Second Temple. It also has a profound spiritual vision. Physically, the temple is now being rebuilt. Ezra's task is to rebuild the spirit of the Jewish nation. And that's, if you've learned Sefer Ezra, you know that, and if you haven't, you should. Right? His work is to strengthen the Jewish people, both to rebuke them, but rebuke them with love, so that there really is a movement towards greater mitzvah observance from those who are present. Why would Ezra be interested in thinking about legislation that make Judaism viable in the diaspora? Firstly, because 4/5 or so, in fact, even more than 4/5 of the Jewish people are still in the diaspora, right? Knows that there is more Jews in the diaspora than there are in Israel. He's lived in the diaspora, so he knows the challenges that have existed. Yes, there is now a temple, so the dissonance between life in Jerusalem and life outside of Israel is actually greater, because when there was a Churban in Israel and Jews in the diaspora, then okay, so you're a Jew in exile almost wherever you are. But once there's a temple, you need to figure out, how do we help those Jews who aren't here to live? And I suppose, and here this is me just supposing, there's also a question of how long is this temple going to last? Because we've just seen destruction. We hope it lives forever. But even when the second temple was rebuilt, as the Sukkim themselves say, there was both celebration and crying. Celebration for those who didn't remember the first Bet HaMikdash, which was glorious, and crying from those who did, because the second Bet HaMikdash was not as glorious as the first. So Ezra doesn't quite know what the future will be physically, and that's why he leans in to invest in the spiritual future of the Jewish people. He knows that Torah is going to be both the glue that holds the Jewish people together wherever they are, Torah surrounded within the Bet HaMikdash, or Torah even disconnected from the Bet HaMikdash. And so Ezra is a great scholar, and known as Ezra Sofer for good reason. And there's lots of things that he himself introduces. But now we're going to be speaking not just as him as an individual, but him as being basically the face of the first chapter of the Knesset Hagdolah. And Knesset Hagdolah is in his life the Sanhedrin, but it basically becomes the snapshots of times in Jewish history over a period of centuries, when scholars gather together in order to make decisions to preserve and strengthen the spiritual legacy of the Jewish people, right? That's what the Knesset Hagdolah do. So they're not like every day. It's not like I go to work, so people go to Knesset Hagdolah like people work in our Knesset, right? But every once in a while, a big meeting has to happen. Just like last night, we had my shul meeting, right? Every year, everyone has an annual shul meeting. They make big decisions about, what color chairs you're going to have. But every few decades, maybe, or maybe even longer, great leaders of the Jewish people gather together to make big decisions for the Jewish people. And that is the work of the Knesset Hagdolah. And we're going to talk about their work, which again spanned centuries. Yeah.
The power of is really in the Golah. And I would think even in the leadership, it was mostly in the Golah. And Purim, one of the issue was like the whole thing of the Yom Ha'Beket Choman and all that, wasn't it coming from Hutzlaretz to Israel? Meaning that whole thing about when Purim should be, meaning so the consideration wasn't of Israel. And I'm also thinking when the Aliyah of Bezar Nehemiah happened, the bulk of I would think the leadership and what we call the Chachamim and all that, I thought, and that I'm just asking, stayed behind. And Ezra and Nehemiah are coming to Israel with really a lot of Sherit HaPledah and people that need a lot of guidance and that are starting from scratch. So it just bewilders me that they start value like this, and in what ways the diaspora accept the ruling when there is that imbalance between them.
I have to apologize. I forgot to put the other mic so that the people on Zoom did not hear.
Okay, so I'll distill the question because it's one which is harder to answer than I can. But Gadol, there are certain institutions which emerge, and it sometimes takes time for their authority to be accepted, right? Even the Mishnah itself, I have an article by David Halivni about the acceptance of the Mishnah written by Yehuda Nasi. You think Yehuda Nasi puts together the Mishnah, great. Well, the answer is it wasn't so great. There was lots of pushback, just as much as there was lots of pushback with the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, even. So, do I know the extent to which the edicts, the rulings of the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, how much they were accepted by Jews in the diaspora at any given chapter in time? I don't. I do know, though, that I don't think there was strong religious leadership in the diaspora. And so if the leadership of the Jewish people is the Knesset Hagdolah, and the Knesset Hagdolah makes decisions in good faith for Jews around the world, some decisions will be better accepted, some won't be. But the sentiment is this is being done for the sake of everybody. It's actually not being done to divide, it's being done to unify. So as long as we're here, or wherever we are, we should have our very best scholars, just like we had our Sanhedrin, doing their job to provide spiritual leadership for the Jewish people with an understanding of the challenges that Jewish people are facing, whether you're here or whether you're there. So I don't think Anshe Knesset Gdola were trying to speak one language in one community and a different to another. I think they were trying to be almost a bridge of sorts, both in terms of location, but also in terms of time. In time, because they've seen Churban, they've seen Binyan, and they don't know what the future is going to be. And they realize there's almost a spiritual foundation that needs to be made to make the Jewish people be able to address almost, we just read Parashat Noach, a teva itself of enactments, right, of decrees, of practices that will be able to weather further storms that may come our way. And that's the sentiment. We'll see a few examples. And I think both here and there, in different ways, different communities adopted different things. But in general, it used to be, now it's less so. If the Rabbanut Rashit here in Israel, even in the early years of the state, said something emphatic that was sensed to be good for Jews around the world, it was done in good faith, and it was understood in good faith, Jews around the world said, fair enough. They may not have done exactly, but people look towards Israel for religious and spiritual leadership. That's now and certainly then. But so the idea here is that Ezra, again, he is the first name for as a member of a religious leadership institution, shall we say both a think tank and decision-making institution, whose task it is to kind of look around what needs to be done and get heads together to think about what should be done in these turbulent times of Jewish history, and again, spanning centuries. So we're talking about Anshe Knesset Gdola. It's not like one generation or two. It's a span from just not long after the building of the Second Temple till not long before the destruction of the Second Temple, right? So centuries. Now, let's see what that means. Again, staying in the same book. The Bible was set in its final form by the Anshe Knesset Gdola under the guidance of Ezra shortly before prophecy ceased to exist. Now, this is going to be an important point too. The Great Assembly consisted of 120 elders, including the last of the prophets under the leadership of Ezra. Now we say, oh, it's not so much about the temple. I mean, the temple's relevant, but actually it's about prophecy. We see a strength of divine communication waning, called Nevuah. There is an understanding that Nevuah is declining from generation to generation. And with that, there needs to be a move by religious leaders to fill that void of the voice from heaven with a voice from earth. We're going to see that language in a moment. And here, amongst the things that they do, and we're going to talk about a number of things they do, and shortly before prophecy ended, meaning this is in the tail end of the biblical period. I mean, Ezra is at the tail end of the biblical period, and we're going to see others too. They say, what is the Bible? What makes the cut? That famous debate about whether Kohelet gets in, Shir Hashirim gets in. These debates are happening with the Knesset Gdola. Why? Because this is a question of legacy, of heritage, of what is Judaism, not just in terms of an institution of a physical building. Even if it exists, most Jews are not there, right? Instead, as a spiritual edifice of Torah. What is Torah? What is Tanakh? What is our tradition? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So Pirkei Avot is emphasizing Torah Shabbat Peh, right? Because we know Moshe received the physical Torah on Mount Sinai. That's a known thing from Torah and whatever. Here we're highlighting the legitimacy of basically rabbinic tradition and rabbinic law. That's part of what Pirkei Avot is doing. It's kind of giving backing to all our sages. It's saying what they say too is part of the Torah that we received there. It's saying don't think that they're just making stuff up. This comes back also as Halacha Moshe Misinai or as Torah Shabbat Peh received from Sinai. But in order for you to know that that's what they're doing legitimately, you need to know that there's a transmission, a Masorah. And so that's why this first Mishnah, the next Mishnayot are crucial, because their point here is how for us to know that what sages said at some point in given history isn't just a product of their time, but instead rooted in that moment in time when we had that revelation called Har Sinai. So yeah, it's emphasizing Torah Shebal Peh, not to negate Torah Shebichtav, but the realm of interest of Pirkei Avot is Torah Shebal Peh, and the teachings in Pirkei Avot are Torah Shebal Peh, which obviously later written down. We're going to see in a second the work of the Anshe Knesset Agdolah is also rooted in an interest in preserving the Torah Shebal Peh, because of course they're listed here. Meaning, we don't think they're just the preservers of the physical text of Torah, although Ezra was. He's called Ezra Sofer for a reason. Not that he was just a stam Sofer, but he cared deeply about the accuracy of the Torah text physically. But he also is part of a team who cares deeply about the accuracy of the Torah Shebal Peh teachings. Right? So that's what we're doing here. But the emphasis in this point in quote 3 is, this is before prophecy ceases. The Anshe Knesset Agdolah step up because they realize that a new tkufa is beginning, whereby a different paradigm of religious leadership and Torah teaching is necessary. Yes, Nevuah was waning. I said that, right? So before prophecy ceased to exist, it's not entirely done, but they sense, they know, they realize that this chapter of Jewish history is coming towards an end. And they feel the need, it's divinely inspired, but they feel the need to be the voices for the next chapter. Just Begadol, although many people talk about this, the person who I think is most eloquent in talking about, shall we say, the different chapters of Jewish history, or how different Jewish history has different chapters, is Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, both in his Torah commentary. He also has a commentary in Pirkei Avot, for those who don't know, called Emet Yaakov. It's a beautiful commentary. And he emphasizes how each name here represents a different kufa with different needs, requiring different solutions. Yes. And all too often, failings in Jewish leadership emerge when we are unaware of a lack of sensitivity to the fact that we're shifting from one kufa to another. And the successes of Jewish history are when we are aware of it, meaning there's always going to be change. The question is, are you on that curve, or can you see it coming? Or are you, unaware until it comes crashing down and you're playing catch up? So a sensitivity towards different kufot in Jewish history in terms of what we do as Jews is essential. And we've seen that in the recent centuries. We're seeing it now too, right? How we respond to different things depends on our awareness of whether we are in a new tkufa or whether we still think we're in an old tkufa. And it exists in every different grouping of Jews, and it's reflected in every different creative introduction of Jews. But certainly in the state of Israel, there are some people who stepped up to the challenge of the new tkufa called Medinat Yisrael, some people who didn't. Some people are now playing catch up, and some people who are almost ahead of the curve. And you read it and you realize, no, they were ahead. When we say they're ahead of their time in both a complimentary way, but it means that the people in that time didn't see what they saw, but then only later on you realize, oh, that's what they were talking about, right? So all of that is connected.
Talking about that, actually talking about, there was an article in one of the magazines about one of the things, and this whole thing that there were people who knew more were teaching other things, they were davening and all kinds of things. And then somebody said, look, yes, but he hasn't got a kippah. So I said, well, hello. Say no more.
We're in a new tkufa.
But also with the Anshe Knesset Agdolah, the whole time they were in existence, the majority of the Jews were in Chutz La'aretz.
The majority of the Jews were in Chutz La'aretz.
So it's different today, because today, finally, the majority of the Jews are in Israel.
Everything's different. I mean, lots of things are different, right?
Yeah.
But their work,
their rulings would be.
okay. that's a whole different question, whether rulings from a time and a place cease to apply when our time and our place are different. I mean, that applies to almost every single thing that we do, right? So could we say that, the whole question of Yom Tov Sheni, like a different time and a place, or now that we are more aware of, we just change the clocks, right? Or we're about to start the 10th Talomata, but maybe we shouldn't because the way in which we live and where we live is different to how it used to be, because that was Nikva, because of, for every single sugya in halacha, that question is a reasonable question. Overall, we have respect for our Masorah, which basically means sometimes we do things which we know are less reflective of our here and now, but they still pay homage to their here and now, because our ancestors continue to live on with us and through us.
Like kidney,
Sorry?
like kidney.
A kidney amongst a million things, though. They're prayers we say, right? Prayers we're talking about destructions from hundreds of years ago. Maybe we should place that within, but actually the memory of Abarachamim is important. Why? Because it is, because certain snapshots of Jewish history shift Jewish history so much that to remove them from our liturgy, even though we are now centuries afterwards, is to almost do a disservice to the impact they've had on our whole offering. And in the future, by the way, the same thing will happen to prayers being penned and memories being recorded from our here and now. So, I think we carry part of our past with us, even though sometimes it doesn't quite reflect the needs and times of our present. Again, some more than others, just as much as, the kippah, by the way, is an incredibly modern innovation. If we really lived how our ancestors lived, we wouldn't be looking the way we look now, and we wouldn't be living the way we live now. But we don't. So we take from the new, but also continue with the old in a kind of complicated and yet still exquisite way.
We grew up in New York in the 60s, and we saw these rabbis who were opening Bate Knesset and opening yeshivot, and because of them, there's Yiddishkeit in America.
Right.
I think
They do. There are different projects that have occurred over the last, call it 100 years. The salvation of the Jewish people after the Shoah and the rebuilding of communities is one of the greatest Chatametim stories that exists. And here we're talking about Jews in America who were literally on the precipice of a cliff, right? You have Hasidic communities which were almost entirely wiped out, and then you look at the big Bell Shul. I mean, like you say, literally from the ashes, you've built remarkable things. But at the same time, how the question then is your reality anchored only in a 19th century lived way of life, or et cetera, et cetera. But I am dazzled by the kind of work of Jews who built strong Jewish communities in places and in times where every betting person would say they shouldn't have succeeded.
Succeed or not.
They didn't succeed all over, but they still succeeded more than you'd think, right? If you've ever been to Gateshead, because I'm originally from England, you think in the middle of a northern town, you have this unbelievably strong, and maybe, but you have this unbelievable strong Jewish community, which has actually provided Torah leaders before the state of Israel was able to do that, right? But the Rabbanim of the 50s and 60s were learning there, but with Dessler and things like that. So, there are, again, remarkable things.
Because it wasn't possible here before the separate state of Israel.
I know. I know. I know historically, and I know ideologically. But that is a great testament to those people who built great things, and we continue to build great things here too.
You're talking about two different things. There's historically what Manhidut has done,
Yeah.
and then there's the things that are going to be left for us. That, like you're saying, there are things that we're doing and things that changes that we're making that in history that will remain for generations to come.
I'm briefly mentioned, it's not my main focus, but yeah.
Agdola is really the Magal from Nebuah. It's a different status and we take it differently than anything that we would do after.
There is, okay, so let's just briefly pause because comparisons are important, but we should need to be clear. The Anshe Knesset Agdola was a unique institution. It doesn't exist. Rav Steinsaltz, who wished to reestablish the Sanhedrin, failed to reestablish the Sanhedrin. There was always discussions about it. Why? Because truth is a kind of consensus that could be created when you have the remnant of prophets and a handful of scholars who are locally based can come together and become the voices for the Jewish world. We don't have that now. There are some voices here, there, and everywhere, and truth is there's lack of cohesion and lack of consistency. So we don't have. I agree, though, we have micro versions where we have leaders trying to do some of the work that was done, but it's not the same thing.
Sorry, well, but you used the phrase "tchiyat metim." You're joking about, like, I understand what you mean, but I wonder if there's actually interpretations where that they say that tchiyat metim is really reviving the legacy and not like if we have anything in our literature that's
Maybe. I mean, people use it poetically. I don't know, poetically, religiously, but I think Tchiyat Meitim as a yesod is understood as, at least as best understood. Yeah.
We should know this, but who determines who is in Anshe Knesset Agdola?
I don't know who determined. I think you kind of get, it's a bit like saying who determines who's in the Hall of Fame, right? So whoever's best to be in the Hall of Fame becomes in the Hall of Fame. Here, they're working with the best scholars who exist. Now, we talk about 120 elders. This number dropped at times. There were times when I think there were 75 members on the Knesset Agdola. The peak was meant to be 120 for lots of different symbolic reasons. Nevertheless, they worked with what they had. The idea was to have a consensus opinion that just like the Knesset, right, which is 120 for this reason, you'd be able to say these many voices came together and this decision is representative of many voices. It's how we run governments. So there's a certain, there was no voting system. There was a sense that if you have that amount of people representing a certain diversity of opinion, then we can assume that this is mukubal by many types of Jews. I mean, I think that's a general sentiment. But let's see who was at least members of the Anshe Knesset Agdola. So we now look at source 4. As mentioned, the only member of the Anshe Knesset Agdola mentioned in Pirkei Avot is Shimon HaTzadik. Nevertheless, rabbinic tradition, various commentaries I'll reference in a second, one, inform us that Ezra and the Great Assembly, consisting of 120 elders, included Haggai, Zechariah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, Nehemiah, Mordechai, Zerubbabel. Here, the last prophets and leaders of the Tanakh were members of the Anshe Knesset Agdola. Mordechai was a member of the Anshe Knesset Agdola, member of this important voice. He was an ambassador of the Anshe Knesset Agdola when he goes back to Pras in order to negotiate and deal with and intervene in terms of building the Bet HaMikdash and eventually, again, the Purim story. So the reason why that's significant is when we look at the end of our Tanakh, we should know that we are also looking at the voices who become significant carriers of the Torah Sheba'al Peh. In fact, even Rav Soloveitchik says, he has a remarkable remark that even Sefer Dvarim is the first book of Torah Sheba'al Peh. Now, I'm not saying that it contains Torah Sheba'al Peh. Obviously, Bereshit Shemot V'Yikra B'Midbar contain Torah Sheba'al Peh, things that God says and are done. But Sefer Dvarim, there's a debate as to what extent Moshe is a co-author, shall we say, of the Sefer, how we interpret it. So Rav Soloveitchik basically says Sefer Dvarim is both Torah Shebechtav and Torah Sheba'al Peh. Okay, interpret as you wish. I'd say as the generations go by, the balance of, shall we say, Torah Shebechtav, in as much as a written record of the word of God and a recalled record of the received word of God, shifts and shifts, right? And so that by the end of the Tanakh, we know the difference between Torah and Nevi'im Ketuvim, right? You have the final leaders being the main carriers of the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the future generation and members of the Anshe Knesset Agdola. So again, in Avot, Shimon HaTzadik, the only one mentioned, but actually, already generations beforehand, we have other leaders who recorded members of the Anshe Knesset Gdolah, starting with Ezra, and including all these others listed here. Now, what do? Well, they were interested in the preservation and strengthening of Judaism. And Judaism includes and primarily focuses on Tosh B'al Peh, because Tosh B'chtav is, at the end of the day, a book that needs to be learned and taught, but it's easier to do because you have a scroll, right? So we see in source 5, the Great Assembly codified much of the oral Torah in a form that could be memorized by the students. This codification was known as the Mishnah. Now, before you say 1 second, the Mishnah was edited by Yehuda Nasi generations later. I say, yeah. That's edited. But the actual memrot, the actual statements, teachings, like we see in Pirkei Avot, right? Well, not the written necessary record, but the endeavor to record Tosh B'al Peh in a memorable way that was then transmitted and sometimes written down, statement by statement, but not as a unified thing, which is called Mishnah, was part of the initial endeavors of the Anshe Knesset Gdolah. Kilu, they'd say, we have a Tosh B'al Peh. Like we're learning Zvachim today, right, in Daf Yomi. We have a tradition about how the offerings were recorded. How can we make sure we don't forget this? Just like when a kid's revising for a math test or an English test, they come up with easy ways to remember it, either poetic ways or fun ways, or Roshei Tevot. That's what Chazal do. We talk about in the end of is it Parshat Vayelech, place it in their mouths. Chazal explains simon means make simanim for Torah, meaning make Torah memorable. So Anshe Knesset Gdolah start working on trying to make the oral tradition memorable by teaching it in ways that will be remembered. That's what we call Mishnah, because Mishnah means to be repeated, make Torah repeatable, right? Now, once it becomes repeatable and it's repeated over generations, then all of a sudden, the rabbis who participate not in just the transmission of what they receive, but the capturing of what they know, when the rest of their sages are sadly often under attack under Roman rule, they fall into that framework of recording teachings and writing teachings, and more becomes recorded, more becomes written, and then Yehuda Nasi has this kind of almost pile of like post-it notes, shall we say, of recorded things. He says, let's make some sense of this. And that's what he creates, called the Mishnah in book. The Mishnah in form, as a concept of teaching ideas in memorable ways, is already being done generations beforehand and initiated as part of this preserving endeavor of the Anshe Knesset Gdolah, both for the sake of Jews in Israel and for the sake of Jews in the diaspora. So it's an easily packaged Tosh B'al Peh idea if you can make it into a sentence which is poetic or uses clever language. Right, 10 things of this or 6 things of that or whatever. All those kind of things we see in Pirkei Avot are meant to be memorable. I personally think that every Jew should know Pirkei Avot, close to B'al Peh, but it's written in a way that's meant to be so. You're supposed to learn it to the point that it should be easily remembered. Those sayings are written in a way that are helpful for us to remember, more conducive. That's right, for memory preservation.
Stand is that Israel is a Shivat Zion. He came back. They had already been in Babel for however many years. And they had set up Rosh Cholah and this and that, Surah and Pompedita. No? So there must have been some learning there or whatever.
No, that's later. They didn't institute where they were. They hadn't instituted proper learning institutions. The Jews are there. There are some. Yeah, that's later on. That's later on. That's already in the. That's already when we talk about the Talmud Bavli. That's when the temple is destroyed, and then those who are in Israel, basically many of them leave, right, and then establish from essential.
Israel comes back 70 years later.
No, that's Ezra's living in the 4th century. The debates about the time, Naniach, right? Let's call it the 4th century BCE, right? The Talmud Bavli is written in basically the 4th century CE, right? 800 years later, right? They're in Bavel principally for
That they were the majority of Jews after the
destruction.
the Galut, after they were taken down to Babel with the Yecheskel and all this.
Yeah.
It was actually a long period of stagnation.
The Jews there, some Jews there basically live there. That we encounter those Jews in the Purim story, right?
Right.
Who are those Jews who are living the Purim story? They're not particularly strongly affiliated Jews. You hear this in terms of the kind of calls to action of Esther, of Mordechai, right? These are Jews who are being told what to do because they don't quite know what to do. These are Jews who are assimilating in one respect or another. Sure, they're being held together by some kind of cultural Jewish identity. But the Jewish people in a time of Purim are not the strongest Jewish community. And of those who come back, and we have their individual names in Sefer Ezra, we know that some have intermarried because that becomes part of the story of Ezra. So from then on, you have the Jews who are living the Second Temple period. You have Jews who are now either there in Bavel or already you've lost the 10 tribes. I mean, that's already happened a couple of centuries beforehand. So you've got these two parallel communities, and already from then on, some Jews are starting to disperse. They're starting to disperse in different parts of the world, such that by the time the Second Temple is destroyed, there's already, shall we say, Gainim of Jews, obviously living in Rome, and there are Gainim of Jews living elsewhere, some strong, some less strong. But Ezra tries to affect change in Jerusalem, which then also tries to be a beacon of change through the unshaken for Jews elsewhere in the world.
So you're saying that could have been the trigger then for them to
I think
start with all this learning and Babel.
It's a trigger for everything. It's a trigger put this way, absent Anshe Knesset Gdolah, there was no future of the Jewish people because Nevuah is ceasing. The Second Temple, we know, is rife with challenges. Soon afterwards, it's destroyed. And then Jews, Bekoshi, are able to, some of them stay in Israel, some already have left by that point, some are then leaving by that point in time. The preservation of the Torah Shabbat Peh, which we read about by Yochanan ben Zakkai in Yavne, now we're talking about centuries after Ezra, right? It's only able to be there because of the work of the Anshe Knesset Gdolah over a period of centuries who are doing what they can to maintain Torah. You see, having the temple is having the temple, but having Torah is having Torah. And the temple and the Torah, though obviously deeply connected, they're not the same thing, right? So they are putting together Tanakh. They're putting together Torah Shabbat Peh in terms of preservable teachings for the future. Here, if you see source 6, this is Gemara Masechet Brachot Michtei Anshe Knesset Gdolah Tiknu Le'em Yisrael Brachot Utfilot Kedushot V'Avdalot. They instituted basically our prayers. Only 2 blessings that we say are Minat Torah, Birkat Torah and Birkat Hamazon. Everything else is rabbinic. Every other blessing that we say may be inspired by a Torah idea or ideal, but they're rabbinic blessings. Which rabbis? The answer is Anshe Knesset Gdolah. All the Amidah that we have, Anshe Knesset Gdolah. The Tefillot that we have, Anshe Knesset Gdolah. The Seder Tefillah, Anshe Knesset Gdolah. Now, did they exist when the temple existed? See, we often think that the prayers were established when the temple was destroyed. No, prayers were established while the temple was in existence, with an awareness the majority of Jews are not living in the country where the temple is, with an awareness that Jews need prayer wherever they are. Now, who was one of the early members of Anshe Knesset Gdolah? Daniel. What does Daniel do? Daniel is one of the great leaders of the Golah, and we learn a lot of the tefillot, a lot of the practices for tefillah, of, for example, facing Jerusalem in prayer from Daniel, right? So we learn from the diaspora community some of the things you need to survive as a Jew when you're in the diaspora. And Anshe Knesset Gdolah, both being informed by that experience, while at the same time living alongside the existence of the Second Temple period, are putting together, shall we say, the survival kit of Jews, wherever they are, in terms of Torah, regarding Tanakh, in terms of Torah Shabbat Peh, in terms of Tefillot, in terms of other edicts. This is saying, this is a Torah that you need to survive wherever we are, whatever's going to happen, whether you're here, whether you're there. You need to daven, you need to pray to God, you need to learn Torah, you need to know what is Torah. There's wisdom you need to learn. There's Torah Shabbat Peh you need to transmit. Be'ezrat Hashem, the temple should remain. But if it's not, or certainly for the Jews who are not here, this is a Judaism that you need to live, because this is learned from the 70 years when they are in Babel. When you're disconnected from the land and you don't have a guidebook, because we didn't, you had a handful of leaders who were not always listened to, then Jews assimilate. Meaning, the whole initiative is to make sure Jews don't assimilate even when they lack those anchors. Instead, Tefillah becomes an anchor, Talmud Torah becomes an anchor, transmission becomes an anchor. The Judaism that we live today is one that is conjured up, shall we say, I don't mean in a flippant way because that suggests it's magic, but it's conjured up by the Anshe Knesset Agdola.
Before then, they still had to have certain halachot that are Baal Peh. So I'm wondering who.
The Nevi'im.
Oh, okay.
Right. So I'm saying that this is the way in the view of Nevuah means that we're going to see in Rabbi Haber's comments are profound.
Not like what we read when we read the Nevi'im.
Right. No, this is what happens next. This is the game plan for when this ends. What is that next chapter? Right. What do we do and how do we make plans for the future? What does Lincoln say? He fails to prepare, fail or something. So this is not us preparing to succeed, preparing to survive.
So the celebrating the Purim story is an also, we have to do this and this and this, and we're adding this on to celebrate the Purim.
Right, and Hanukkah too, all these things are coming through the Anshe Knesset Agdola, right?
So
Let's have a seat.
Basic laws like Shabbat, let's say.
Shabbat is from the Torah. Shabbat is from the Torah.
I know, but I'm saying there's still, even before electricity in the modern age, there had to be interpretations like how far you can walk, and that's, I guess, that all came from the Nevi'im. They gave those laws. We don't read.
Yeah, and the Torah Shabbat Peh, right? That's the Torah B'chtav and Torah Shabbat Peh, but they're preserving it, right? And they're explaining it.
Put down the Torah Shabbat.
So in this time period, people are recording it, and later on it's written down. Let's have a see of two further things, which I think is important just to give some greater clarity. One, a piece from Ben Hillel, and then one from Rabbi Haber. So the dramatic transition from a world characterized by divine revelation to one governed by acquired knowledge meant that the men of the Great Assembly had to bring about far-reaching changes in the way people interacted with the Torah. In particular, their twofold challenge was to change, one, the context of this interaction, bring the Torah out of the temple into the world of the people, and two, the nature of this interaction, moving from the world of prophets and visions to one of tradition and learning. I think it's a beautiful explanation of what we said so far, right? That's the work of Anshe Knesset Agdola. I want us to now hear this, though, from a slightly more, shall we say, spiritual perspective, because we quoted three teachings from Anshe Knesset Agdola. Okay, with one mistranslated, whatever, right? I mentioned last time that Rabbi Yaakov Haber's commentary on Pirkei Avot gives us insight about the personalities whose Torah we learn. It's a beautiful commentary. And so here's a piece from it. Again, this is a Sefer. I sent you a link to be able to buy it. There was amongst the things. So this is a Sefer I really, really highly recommend. And he has more about this. Is actually only a shorter excerpt of a longer piece. So, in the time of the Anshe Knesset Agdola, you have a fusion, a blend of wisdom and prophecy. עד כבר זו הייתה תורת דבר השם אל האדם, ואם היה איזה ספק במסורה, היו שואלים את דבר השם על ידי נביא, והיו מסתכלים כלפי מעלה, שישלח להם הקדוש ברוך הוא עוד לאורותם הדרך אשר ילכו בה. Basically, until that point, you have a question, you go to Navi, the Navi somehow seeks clarity from the Eibishter, and Akadosh Baruch Hu gives some kind of response. The Navi responds. Wonderful. Again, it's more complicated than that because the Navi didn't have complete clarity in terms of both how to communicate to God and how God communicated with them. It's what we call aspat klarisha in a me'ira. Nevertheless, there was that mechanism. אבל בימי עזרא התחיל הצירוף של החכמים לנביאים, ומאז התחילו להסתכל בתורה שלפניהם כדי להבין דעת עליון ורצון השם. From the time of Ezra onwards, we don't look to the prophets, look heavenwards. We look to the Torah for clarity. Meaning, not to say that we didn't look for the Torah, but we had this amazing hotline to God. So if I don't understand something in Torah, I say, call the hotline. Well, the hotline stops working. So we say, well, we better figure out how to decode the Torah better or how to relate to the Torah better for it to be our hotline. He continues, וזה היה שינוי מהותי בהבנת התורה, ובמקום להסתכל כלפי מעלה, לקבל הודעה בבחינת התראותא דלעילא, התחילה תקופה של התראותא דלתתא, להבין דבר השם על ידי עמילות בלימוד התורה. He says this was a significant shift in terms of our relationship with Torah. And now he uses two phrases which are important, and he uses them often, he likes them, and so do most mystical writings too. Itra'uta means a stirring up, right? Hitorurut, right? Letata means below, and le'ela means above. Itra'uta de letata means a stirring up, meaning doing something or something occurring from the lower, generally meaning our physical world, okay? Itra'uta de le'ela means a stirring up from heaven, meaning some kind of divine calling or divine response. So he says here, this was a significant change now in a relationship with Torah. Rather than looking upwards, and wishing to seek guidance from a heavenly source, namely God or prophet representing the Ratzon Hashem. A new tkufa begins, shel itra'uta delatata, of us basically doing the work to, shall we say, plumb the depths of the Torah to gain insight about Ratzon Hashem. Lavin dvar Hashem al yedei amelut b'limud haTorah. Rather than us calling heavenward, our job is to look deep, right? Now, once we understand that that's really the work of the Anshe Knesset Gdolah, this shift from Itra'uta de le'el to Itra'uta de letata, which is how Rabbi Heber frames it. He says, now you can understand the Mishnah. Now, before we go on, this is something which, when we quote him again, I want you to appreciate the brilliance both of him and of really what is Pirkei Avot. The teachings of the teachers that we're taught in Pirkei Avot are relating to those teachers, meaning part of this whole course is to say maybe there are teachings of particular sages which reflect their time and place. Why is the Anshe Knesset Gdolah teaching us? I mean, I could also say that's a good thing, that you should be reflective, you should have many students, and you should be cautious in how you live your Judaism. I mean, I could also teach you that. The fact is, I would teach it in a pathetic way, they're teaching it in a remarkable way, because these three teachings are reflective of their legacy. Okay? If these are the three teachings which preserved in Pirkei Avot as the work of the Anshe Knesset Gdolah, our job is to plumb the depths of these three teachings, because once you understand them, then you understand who is Anshe Knesset Gdolah. This is what Rabbi Heber does in the next paragraph. And again, this is he goes on a little bit longer than this, but I've just tried to keep it relatively short. Thus, the sages of their generation, namely the men of the Great Assembly, said three things. Have a matunim badin, be wary, or pause for thought. What's that? No, I'd say it's more about be cautious when you make decisions, and perhaps something like that, right? Decisions of all sorts, including din, meaning judgment, but arguably all decisions. Have a matunim badin. Klamar kevan she'achshav hadin bi'adenu. The Anshe Knesset Gdolah talking to themselves. Now that we are the arbiters of what is right and wrong, because we can't turn to the prophets. It's on us. We're the Dayanim, we're the Rabbanim, meaning the world that we are now familiar with, namely rabbinic law. But they're the first wave of this, where they carry the torch of Itra'uta Delatata. Have a matunim badin. Since the din is bi'adenu, tzrichim anu lizaher ba me'od me'od. We have to be very, very careful. Meaning, we have an awesome responsibility. We are now not just the transmitters of a tradition being received from heaven, but instead we become the voice of the tradition, which is being drawn from the well called Torah. So let's be responsible here. We got to, be very thoughtful, make sure we don't over-interpret or under-interpret, don't over-apply, under-apply. In the Torah we have Bal Tosif, Bal Tigra. They're saying this to themselves in terms of Torah Shabbal Peh. Hadavar Sheni hu ha'emidu talmidim harbeh. Establish, stand up many students. By the way, ha'emidu, I've quoted before, Rav Shimon Schwab has a stunning piece about that phrase. because Matan Torah is known as Ma'amad Har Sinai. The idea that when we received Torah, we stood. And over the years, we see in the time of Rabbi Gamliel, sages started to sit for receiving the Torah. Then when basically you learn, you sit down. When you talk about people sitting and learning, it's not mikra. Why don't we say standing and learn? Because now we sit and learn. But Torah was originally received standing. Them saying, Hemidu Talmidim Habeh means we should make sure we establish students who receive a Torah in the same spirit as we received the Torah at Ma'amad Har Sinai, at the standing.
Or the matun and.
Oh, that too, right? Meaning, they don't think that they are giving Torah again. They're wishing to remind themselves the bridge between what we're doing and what we received is narrow, and we need to make sure that we don't fall one way or another. So Hemidu Talmidim Harbeh. ואין לומר שהמשכת התורה ביד השם היא ויהיה מה שיהיה כיד הרבה, כיוון שנכנסו לתקופת התראות לטאטא התורה בידינו. Meaning, we're not in a fortunate position to simply say, it'll be what it will be, God will make sure the Torah gets transmitted and whatever. We need to take a more active role in the transmission of Torah. It's on us to find Talmidim. It's on us to find the right Talmidim. It's on us to demand that they be standing and upstanding Talmidim. Right? ועלינו מוטל החוב והאחריות להמשיך התורה על ידי העמדת תלמידים הרבה. ומפני כן, in addition to that, עשו סייג לתורה, make boundaries for the Torah, כיוון שמושכל ראשון לכאורה היה ראוי להם להתאבל על אובדן הנבואה וההסתכלות ההתראות האלה. He said, on first glance, perhaps they should have just been depressed. Nevuah is ending, and Tkufa is ending, and it's depressing. How the good old days are about to end. They realize that with the loss of one came responsibility of a new chapter of Jewish history. Now that everything is in our hands, יכולים אנו לעלות אפילו למעלה מכוחותינו ולהבין את רצון השם מצוותיו על ידי עמלנו גרידא בבחינת התראות דלתתא. We can both comprehend Torah, but also we can be foolish in thinking we comprehend more of Torah than we do. So there are these three teachings where we have Hamatunim Badin. We need to be cautious and responsible. We need to be active generators of new generations of Torah teachers and Torah voices. And at the same time, we need to protect the Torah, right? Our job isn't to innovate and come up with new things. We need to guard the Torah. That's our ultimate responsibility. We are looking after something so precious, and we can't blame anybody else. God has now said, you, the Anshe Knesset Gdolah, as those who stepped up to the plate, to be those who represent the Jewish people wherever they are. Well, you have certain license, you have certain flexibility, you have certain opportunities to add, to develop, to formulate, to codify. But never forget, at the end of the day, you are the people who are in charge of the, we just had this break-in in the Louvre, right? You're in charge of the ultimate crown jewels, the Torah, Asusiag the Torah. Protect it at all costs. So these three teachings they're not teaching the Anshe Knesset telling us, they're teaching Anshe Knesset telling themselves. This is on their fridge, imagine in their staff room, right? This is listed saying, this is what we need to remember, guys, right? All the time. This is our mission statement.
Where was their staff room? Where did they sit? The Anshe Knesset Hagdolah.
So I think they sat wherever they could sit. There were times they sat in Yerushalayim there. Sometimes they sat elsewhere. I don't know if we have a record of all the different locations where they met. I'm sure we have some.
Israel or no?
It was always in Israel, right? There was a Lishka of the Sanhedrin, right? But I don't know we talk about, there was a period where we talk about the Anshe Knesset being the Sanhedrin, right? But then they seem to emerge from the Sanhedrin, meaning we should be wary to think that they are one and the same. I think they were sometimes one and the same, but the Sanhedrin themselves also waned.
The people who made up the Sanhedrin were these people who were all over.
Right. Right, right. But I don't know whether that's consistently the case. Nevertheless, wherever they were, and wherever they needed to meet, there were sometimes challenges where people said we have to meet, and if it meant that they were somewhere else, I guess that's where they would do that. We see these, we read on Leila Seder how these 5 great sages met in Bnei Brak. Why in Bnei Brak? By the way, they were all leaders of different cities, and there were different commentaries. But suffice to say, these 5 sages had to meet, and they met where they could meet.
But Mordechai didn't live in Israel.
Mordechai was a member of Anshe Knesset Gdolah. The way Rav Schwab explains it in his commentary on Ezra Nehemiah, which is beautiful, is that he was part of, if you in Sefer Ezra, it says, list the people who came, including a guy called Bilshan. So Mordechai who Bilshan. That's why is he called Bilshan? Because he was Baal Lashon. He knew many languages. So his name was Bilshan, and he came to Israel to rebuild the second temple. Then the second temple project was stalled because Koresh dies and problems are caused. So he then goes, basically a bit like Jared or whoever it is, right, to try and fix all the problems. He says, I'm here to fix. They come, apparently they were like round the corner from my house and tried to kill my gut, right?
Yeah.
Right?
It's 2 hours.
The vice president was coming minutes from my house. So so the short answer is they met where they met.
But this is.
Okay. Sorry? So let's explain the way I understand, and there are scholars disagree on this.
Yeah.
Okay. But the first temple is destroyed. All of Jews are outside of Israel for 52 years. According to the Gemara, there was no Jews in Israel for 52 years. Okay, we always say there was always Jews in Israel. Chazal say no, 52 years, we were literally kicked out. That's mamash, exile. Then Koresh basically writes the original Balfour Declaration. And by the way, work has been done, that literally the Balfour Declaration is almost word for word like Koresh's declaration, almost in quantity of words and phraseology. And Balfour, by the way, did that deliberately because he was.
Video of there was some newspaper guy asking Trump's representative if he's also going to make a third base.
Oh, yeah.
I saw it.
That's very funny.
But actually the Speaker of the Knesset made it very clear. He said, I see Trump as Koresh, but he's not the first, by the way. This has happened many times. When Margaret Thatcher came to the Knesset years ago, she was called that, and another American president, he was called, meaning what we've basically done is non-Jewish leaders who've done us significant favors above and beyond what we think is expected. We've used that language of Koresh. Anyway, Koresh dies, and Daryavesh, and that whole story means that the temple building project is stalled because the Amoraim here in Israel create a problem. So Mordechai goes back, and he becomes this ambassador of the Jews in Israel to fix the permission which has now been halted to build the temple. He's there. That's when the Purim story happens. So this is Achashverosh, right? Achashverosh is immediately after Koresh. And then we know what happened in the Purim story. Who's the next? Then it's Daryavesh. Daryavesh gives permission and he goes back. So he's back and forth.
Fascinating though, because it's not like today. And how are they so on top of what's happening with each other? It's
letters and letters that we read in Purim story. They wrote letters. Anyway, I'm aware of time, and I wanted to learn one more thing. Sorry?
Why did it collapse?
I don't think it collapsed. I think that the whole point is that Kufot, it morphed into a different period of time called the Zugot, and the Zugot morphed to a different period of time called the Tanaim, and the same with Amoraim. Meaning, there are solutions that work for certain things that stop working because they're not relevant. Our situation has changed, the needs have changed, the tasks have changed, the people have changed, whatever. So there's no failure or success. It's a shift. Okay, I want to learn just one piece of Gemara because again, we're out of time. Let's learn this and then further questions. This is quite a fascinating Gemara. It's told better in the Yerushalmi, but it's also found in Brachot Lamed Gimel Lamed Bet in the Bavli, but not as full. I'm going to read it in English for the sake of flow. Okay. Rabbi Shimon said in the name of Yoshua ben Levi, why are they called the men of the Great Assembly? Why are they called Anshe Knesset Gdolah? Right? Now, principally, the answer is because they gathered and they created a kind of Knesset, a Knessiyah of gathering. That's a short answer. But what makes them great? Meaning, well, I know the word Knesset. What makes them Gdola? What makes them great? You know, sounds quite a lot of hubris for somebody to say, I'm part of the great club. And the answer given is because they restored the crown, the greatness, to its former glory. Why so? Because we have a pasuk. Moshe Rabbeinu basically said, describing Kodesh Baruch Hu as Ha'el HaGadol HaGibor VaHaNorah. Okay. Then what happens is, Yirmiyahu prophesying the destruction of the first temple, he used a different phrase. Ha'el HaGadol HaGibor. What is not there? HaNorah. Why does Yirmiyahu omit HaNorah? Because the short answer is, he says, as we say here, why did he say the mighty? He may be properly called mighty because he did witness destruction and is silent. Why did he not say the word awesome Norah? Awesome only applies regarding the temple, and if there's no temple, there's no Norah, right? Meaning, Yirmiyahu basically said, how on earth can we refer to God as Norah when there's a lack of temple, which I associate with Norah, as we have a pasuk in Tehillim, Norah Elohim Mikdashecha. Daniel, who is then sent to the Galut, a different chapter of Jewish history, right? Amar Ha'el HaGadol VaHaNorah, right? What is missing there? HaGibor, yes? Why does it not say Gibor? His sons are put in neck irons, whereas Gvura. And if so, then why did he say Norah? Because he may well be called Norah for the wonders he did for us in the fiery oven. Now, this is one of the most fascinating pieces of the Gemara, because what it's telling us is different leaders relate to God at different times based on the different challenges they face. Moshe Rabbeinu was able to see God as being Ha'el HaGadol HaGibor VaHaNorah. Yirmiyahu struggles to see all of those accolades. Daniel struggles to see all of those accolades. They see some, not all. What do Anshe Knesset Gdola do? Why are they called Gdola? Continues the Gemara. Kivan Shamdo Anshe Knesset Gdola. When men of great assembly came, it literally means when they amdu, stood up, right? Meaning when they formed themselves and determined what their task was. Now this is after Daniel, right? Maybe centuries after, but nevertheless. And here we're talking also about tefillah, because they were creating the prayers, which include this phraseology. They restored it, meaning the prayers that we have use a phraseology of Moshe, not of Yirmiyahu, not of Daniel. Why? Does flesh and blood have power to set limits in these matters? Rabbi Yitzchak ben Elazar said the prophets know that their God is truth and they will not fawn before him. Okay. This is a Gemara you can explain and explore and interpret and delve into in a million different ways. Overall, just think about what we've said over this session and this Gemara. It tells us that Anshe Knesset Gdola said, we see the arc of Jewish history, that the many bumps in the road that we've experienced, with the destruction of the first temple, with the exile, Yirmiyahu representing the destruction, Daniel representing the exile. We happen to be living in a time where there's a second temple, but that's not the ikar, by the way. We feel a duty to make sure that you realize that the Torah we keep is still connected to Moshe Rabbeinu. They feel responsibility to maintain, to preserve the relationship with God as Moshe expressed it, and to find ways to explain to the Jewish people how that's viable even when life is challenging, even when many are in Galut, even when some don't have the temple, or even when there's no temple at all. So this Gemara is a beautiful piece because it doesn't just explain the word, why they're called Anshe Knesset Gdola. It explains their Gadlut. How is it possible that after all these great challenges, we're still able to say Ha'el HaGadol HaGibor VaHaNorah? We've been saying these words, despite horrific things. How could we say Ha'el HaGadol HaGibor VaHaNorah El Elyon? How could we say these even in the things we've seen in the past couple of years? The short answer is because we believe in the resilience of the Jewish people that's been around for thousands of years, has seen destruction, has seen horrific things. And the very fact that we stand today, and just think about that language, and think about what they taught in Pirkei Avot, we're still standing. We can say "Hala Gadol Gibor V'Nora" precisely because, yeah, we know what's happened. We're not blind. We're smart. We know what people have done to us. We're still standing. Tonight, as it happens, my third daughter's going on her Poland trip. She's in Kita Yud Bet. And over Shabbat, we were talking about, obviously the Shoah and things she's going to see. We're able to still go to Poland, and even there, in the most horrific places where the most horrific things are done to Jews, we're able to say, or at least some are able to say, I don't think everybody's been able to. Why? Moshe Rabbeinu said it. But you say, okay, but Moshe Rabbeinu, how much destruction did he actually say? See, I'd say, you're right. And Yirmiyahu felt he couldn't. And Daniel felt he couldn't. And Sheikh Knesset Gdolah, these generations of scholars who lived through hardship, who lived through exile, who lived through destruction, who saw bad things, who saw destruction, who lived through the Hanukkah story, who knew that Jews were persecuted, right? Who saw many stuff in many different ways. They said, Hever, you're right. But the strength of Jewish people is knowing that we are plugged into Moshe. We're plugged into Al Sinai. That we're still standing at Mount Sinai. We continue to stand as a Jewish people. And that's who are the Anshe Knesset Gedolah. I want you to understand them. They are the driving force for the continuation of Tosh Valpeh with the Zugot, with the Tanaim and Amoraim, because they give faith the existence of Torah, absent of the temple, absent of residents in the land of Israel, absent of good times. That even in the worst times, Jews were able to say, I choose to say these words because in so doing, I testify to the God that Moses testified to, and knowing that Moses is alongside me, and knowing that the Jewish people is alongside me, and knowing that through the Torah and standing back at Mount Sinai, I gain more strength that means even our worstest enemies can never diminish us. And we saw that. We saw that how Chayalim were learning Daf Yomi in the most difficult of places. And the moment they're doing that, they're not just back in the Bet Midrash of the yeshiva they're studying in, they're back at Har Sinai. Hey, Midu. They may have been lying down, but they were standing tall. But they said, nobody's going to push us down. We stand tall with our tradition. And this is Anshe Knesset Gedolah. They daven with the words of Anshe Knesset Gedolah, which are meant to bring us back to Sinai, meant to bring us back to Moshe. They learn the Torah that have been preserved through the Anshe Knesset Gedolah. So they're able to learn Tosh Valpeh. Balpeh Mamash, many of them didn't have time, they're sharing words of wisdom. The Chatufim were sharing words of wisdom. Chatufim were saying brachot in the tunnels. Who made those brachot? Anshe Knesset Gedolah. You've probably seen the videos, they're saying the hamotz in the mazonot and things like that. Who said those? Who made those? Anshe Knesset Gedolah. How can they call Gedolah? Because they said, no matter what, we're Gadol. No matter what, we stand. Wow. So the legacy of this body of people, and the fact is we don't need to know their names. Because although Ben Hillel says we don't know any of their names other than Shimon HaTzadik, and we do know a little bit more, we don't know most of their names, and certainly don't know when they all met, where they all met, all that they did. Okay, we know though that there were times in Jewish history when people saw a void, and they said, you either get busy living or get busy dying. You either get ready to preserve Jewish people or get ready to realize that we're going to be another museum piece. And that was what they did. So we don't learn much about Anshe Knesset Gedolah. We have so much to thank them for because they lay the foundation for who we are and how we live, both strengths and complications. So I hope this has been of use. I'm sure there's still questions. Remember to send to me. Remember also that even great books about the sages also can be complemented by seemingly simple books like the Handbook of Jewish Thought. It's not so simple. It's a beautiful work by Rabbi Heber. It's a time of Jewish history and many other things too. And I look forward to learning about Shimon HaTzadik and others in the coming weeks.
Thank you. It's beautiful.
Pleasure.
Yes.